Well, as likely everyone knows, our speaker for tonight is Kim Thorburn, who's been working on the grouse recovery program for a long time, along with Lindell. And she's former president of Spokane Audubon, a longtime member, our Washington Fish and Wildlife Commissioner. And I guess without further ado, the floor is yours, Kim.
Get myself unmuted. Have to push all the buttons. Thanks, Gary. And I will try to share my screen here. Need to, there. So I have to admit that when I'm talking about something that I'm really passionate about, and shrub steppe is something I'm really passionate about, shrub steppe conservation, it's hard to fit it all in a half hour. So I've learned this trick. I just make a few slides, but I put a whole bunch on all of the slides. So we'll see how I do. There's a lot that I can talk about. I think shrub steppe is all come to all of our Eastern Washington attention because of the unfortunate circumstances of Labor Day and the wildfires that have taken a lot of habitat and this ecosystem, and it's been an increasing problem and threat to this ecosystem, which is considered imperiled already in Washington State, and we'll be talking about that. So I'm going to, first of all, just kind of talk about the shrub steppe ecosystem and set the stage for what we're talking about. What I really want to emphasize is the rich biodiversity of the ecosystems, and just bring up some of the amazing wildlife that one finds amongst the amazing plants and vegetation. I'll then turn to wildfire as a threat to the ecosystem, but also talk specifically about the worst Labor Day ever that we faced a couple of months ago. And then finally wrap up with restoration work that's going on, and we have Mike Finch here today. Mike is the assistant manager of the Swanton Lakes Wildlife Area, and probably one of the most knowledgeable individuals in the department and the state on wildlife restoration. I'll tell the story. When the fire went through, Mike was there, and I went to the office, and it was becoming apparent that the office was threatened. And what he saved first was his record of restorations that have gone on through the years at Swanton Lakes. And what an important document, because so much of the work is experience and learning by trial and error. So really important. And as I said, Mike really is a lead expert in the state on this. And finally, note that there is also resilience in the habitat itself. So shrub steppe is simply defined an arid ecosystem that has enough precipitation to support vascular shrubs. And it really is a predominant ecosystem of the western United States. This map shows where there's shrub steppe in the United States. The different colors represent the different shrub communities. There are different shrubs that predominate, and the dark olive green here, this is the Columbia Basin shrub steppe, this is the Great Basin shrub steppe. The sagebrush is the predominant plant. In Washington State, shrub steppe was the predominant ecosystem of all of eastern Washington. All this brown is the historic boundary of the shrub steppe. The green areas are pretty much the mountain areas of eastern Washington, which have forest ecosystems. The present day map, the dark brown is the remaining shrub steppe. This is from a 1996 study that evaluated remaining shrub steppe, intact shrub steppe in eastern Washington. The light brown, most of it's agricultural conversion, and it's kind of interesting if you look at where the light brown areas are. Those are the deeper soil areas, like in the Palouse, where agriculture has occurred, and that's really where most of the conversion of shrub steppe has happened through the years. As I mentioned, in our shrub steppe, sagebrush is the predominant shrub. It really defines our basin, Columbia Basin and Great Basin shrub steppe. The main sagebrush that we see, we have 3 species of sagebrush in Washington State. The main one that we see is this one called big sagebrush, or Artemisia tridentata. When you're out there, this is the big shrub that you're seeing predominantly. It really is all over the place. The other sagebrush that I show here, this one is a very short plant called rigid sagebrush, or Artemisia rigida. And it grows in very thin soils, and it is very short. It's interesting, this one is evergreen. It does not lose its leaves through the winter, but our other 2 species, like the rigida, it does lose its needle-like leaves. In fact, I'm always amazed because they look completely dead in the winter. They're covered with lichen, and it's always surprising to me in late spring when they begin to bud and regrow, because they really look like dead plants growing in rocks in the winter. The third one is called 3-tip sagebrush, or Artemisia tripartita. There are other vegetative components to sagebrush, and there are other shrubs as well, but I want to focus on grasses and what we call forbs, which are non-grass or other non-grass herbs, or what we see as wildflowers in the shrub steppe. The important grasses are perennial bunch grasses, and they will often occur in areas with very little shrub, we refer to as meadows, or as understory to the shrub. And they are very important to not only the vegetative community, but also to the wildlife that reside in the shrub steppe. The wildflowers are quite amazing. I didn't pick out ones here that are important as forage for most of the wildlife, but to show that there's a lot of beauty. Of course, the bitterroot that grows also in the rocky soil, this lower one, and this one, the sagebrush Mariposa lily, is incredible when everything else is dried up in almost the end of summer. This beautiful flower blooms, and you wonder, where did that come from? and then a couple of types of Erigonium or can't think of the common name right now. So as I mentioned, the shrub steppe is just an incredibly rich community of wildlife, as well as the plants that we talked about. And what I'm showing here is, to back up, as I've said, and as the map of our Columbia Basin shrub steppe shows, it is a very threatened ecosystem, imperiled, disappearing. There's been a lot of conversion in the Columbia Basin due to agriculture, other urban development, and then a couple of other threats, the wildfires and invasive species that we'll talk about in a few minutes. So what that means is wildlife species that are dependent on this ecosystem are also facing threats and population declines. And many of the species are really obligate during all of the year or part of the year, meaning they must have shrub steppe to reproduce, or in the case of greater sage grouse and sharp-tailed grouse that reside in them year-round, they depend on it for forage as well. And so what I've picked out, the state is required to do what's called the State Wildlife Action Plan to receive federal funding for mitigation and recovery of imperiled species. It's a every 10-year process. It's a public process. What the mandate is to identify wildlife species and their ecosystems or habitats that face serious threats and need mitigation and recovery actions. And so what I'm showing here on this slide are the birds of the shrub steppe. Most of them are obligates. The loggerhead shrike can actually live in different ecosystems. But these are the birds that are listed as what are known as species of greatest conservation need in the State Wildlife Action Plan. The ferruginous hawk actually, in addition to being a species of greatest conservation need, is state listed as threatened. The rest of these, I think, are all candidates for listing, but definitely listed in the SWAP, which is an indication that the state is paying attention to both the ecosystem they depend on, as well as mitigation and recovery actions. One of the problems we have with species of greatest conservation need, I'll call out the songbird survey as an important activity, is for a lot of these animals, we're not real confident about our population counts and actually what the baseline was when it started, but most of the species of greatest conservation need in Washington State, there's real concern that they're declining, in part because of the habitat loss, or sometimes we have data to support information about their declines. It's not just birds that are obligate or associated with the shrub steppe that are in decline and identified as species of greatest conservation need. I show here 3 of the mammals that are species of greatest conservation need in our State Wildlife Action Plan, or SWAP. Both species of jackrabbit actually are listed as candidates. Actually, the jackrabbit that we see more often is the white-tailed jackrabbit. The thinking is that the black-tailed jackrabbit was not historically native to the Columbia Plateau or the Columbia Basin, but it definitely has expanded into it. But the white-tailed jackrabbit is more common, but both are species of greatest conservation need. There are not a lot of reptiles that we see out there, but a couple of them are on the list. I've never seen a sagebrush lizard in Washington State. I do really enjoy running across pygmy horned lizards, but there is a real concern about their survival. I need to mention also the importance of our shrub steppe, our Eastern Washington, Columbia Basin shrub steppe to waterfowl. As we know of waterfowl, they migrate. They're long-range migrators. Most of them breed in the Arctic, and there are highways of migration that they follow. We're the Pacific flyway. And as you can see from this, a lot of Eastern Washington, or rather here, is part of the flyway. And these waterfowl come through in both directions and are very dependent on the potholes of the shrub steppe, which is the geologic association of the shrub steppe. Again, Spokane Audubon participated with Ducks Unlimited and the department on a very important survey of the spring waterfowl migration that was really the first and best documentation of how important the shrub steppe potholes are to the Pacific flyway. You might be thinking, well, she left out a couple of really important associated species, but I wanted to note that yes, the Columbia sharp-tailed grouse, the greater sage grouse, and the pygmy rabbit are definitely in the state wildlife action plan. They are all listed, state listed, as I said, so is the ferruginous hawk, but I wanted to highlight the sharp-tailed grouse, the greater sage grouse, and the pygmy rabbit because they were all three species were very impacted by the Labor Day fires and the loss of habitat that's resulted. Pygmy rabbits were considered, they're state endangered. They were considered extirpated from the Columbia Basin. And there's been a reintroduction program that the department has been undertaking for a number of years. It's quite technical. They actually did captive breeding, or continue to do captive breeding. They bring rabbits in from, I think, Utah. They do captive breeding. They were unable initially to release the rabbits into the wild, and had to release them into large enclosures, which we still have, and then acclimate them to the wild, and eventually some of them get completely released. Unfortunately, the largest enclosure burned in the Pearl Hill fire, and all the rabbits were lost. There was also a release area that was completely burned. It was more than 50% of the pygmy rabbits involved in the recovery program that were lost in the Pearl Hill fire of September. In addition, we at Swanson Lakes had every single one of our Lex fern, that's sharp-tails and sage-grouse. The Pearl Hill fire, the initial estimate that I heard, there were 33 Lex divided between the two species that burned. And Lex burning isn't a problem, but Lex, because, you know, the birds try to find sort of open areas to do these wonderful dances. But the problem is the hens need to go nest, and it's the nesting habitat that is lost that leads to the dissolution of the Lex as a result of burning. I've alluded to a couple of times, the shrub steppe has been a priority for Spokane Audubon Society for a number of years. The community science projects that have been undertaken really have been based in the shrub steppe. There was the shrub steppe songbird survey that Christy Nielsen from Audubon, Washington oversaw, and of course many of you participated in. Very important work. It gets to that issue that I raised when I was talking about our species of greatest conservation need. The three key birds that you were looking at, the sage thrasher, the sage-brush sparrow, and the brewer sparrow, which I show here. Two of those are species of greatest conservation need, and we really needed some good data on what their current population is. And the shrub steppe songbird survey was certainly providing a lot of that good data. That we've, for a number of years, had the Lex surveys and other prairie grass recovery activities that have, in recent years, mostly contributed to the Lex surveys, which is how we count sharp-tail grass and sage-grouse. So now I'm going to move to the issue of wildfire. As I mentioned, we've been losing shrub steppe in Washington State for probably a century with complete conversion. There are added threats to development, and the main ones are wildfire and invasive species. Wildfire is, as with all arid ecosystems, very much a component of the system of the community. Shrub steppe has always experienced wildfire. It actually becomes an important part of how the system survives. It kind of cleans it out, so to speak. And the problem that has occurred is that a couple of issues, climate change and invasive weeds, have changed the wildfire cycle drastically, both in terms of how often these fires occur, as well as the intensity of the fires. The underlying condition in climate change that contributes to both the intensity as well as the more frequency of wildfires is drought. We're seeing prolonged drought, we're seeing really drying droughts, and it just really has impacted, in fact, both the wildfires of early September, the Pearl Hill wildfire shown here. This is the Moses Coulee area, and the Okanagan actually jumped the Columbia River and then the Whitney Hill fire over here, which is the one that burned Swanson Lakes, really weather events entirely. If you can remember Labor Day, it was blowing hard, a land wind, or el viento del diablo, as it's known. I used to be familiar with them being a native Californian as the Santa Anas, but they've become much more prevalent here as a result of climate change. They're different than our prevailing winds. The humidity drops below 10 as it was on Labor Day, and it doesn't take much of a spark to explode, and that's exactly what happened with both the Whitney Road and Pearl Hill fires. Very much weather events. It leads to difficulty in getting any control while that kind of weather is going on. The other contributor in terms of the changing character of wildfires is invasive weeds, and particularly the one that we talk about is cheatgrass, as shown here. So this is I'm just gonna take you through a little bit of the destruction of the Whitney Road wildfire. It kind of was like a sock in the stomach to go out and see it a short while after it burned. And I looking at Mike, who was right there, I think our first reaction was grieving and just shock at what just looked like total destruction. I'll quickly show that infrastructure loss for those of you who are familiar with Swanson Lakes. This is the old barn, and this is the old house, which used to house the office. The office moved recently into this building, which used to be the residence of Julie Anderson, the manager of Swanson Lakes. And a little Spokane Audubon connection here. As you can see, the fire burned pretty close around 3 sides of the house. I only show one side here. There was the vinyl covering, and it kind of melted. It does not look like there was a lot of burning there, and this area had just been laid down as gravel for parking because the office, it is the office, and we were also preparing to use it as a bunkhouse for volunteers. And we needed a lot of good area for parking. The connection to Spokane Audubon is that we were able to provide some funding for the gravel to support the volunteers. And we think that it's really the gravel that provided sort of the fire-safe area and preserved a lot of the building here. So yay for us at Spokane Audubon that we were able to help out, and yay for Mike for getting the gravel laid in time. So other infrastructure, the power, all the utility, the power utility was completely wiped out. It was amazing to see. These are lines down right next to the office. This is one example of one of the power poles. A lot of them were completely burned, and the power lines were hanging with just the cross areas. These are all the poles that were removed. I think Inland Power had the poles back up within 2 weeks after the fire. It was quite amazing. And they were able to preserve a lot of the crossbars, which is important because there's a project that Swanson Lakes has partnered with Inland Power where there have been raptor deterrents placed on the poles. We've tried to remove a lot of potential raptor perches, because they are a problem for many of our imperiled species. And where we haven't been able to remove the perches, we try to put deterrents on them, and they were able to spare a lot of the deterrents. So you go out and look at all the new poles out at Swanson Lakes, and many of them still have the raptor deterrents. And then other infrastructure, fencing that burned, fortunately, a lot of the fencing had been removed from the interior because grouse fly low, and fence collision is a cause of mortality. So there is not a lot of interior fencing, but the exterior fencing, there was some destruction. Fortunately, a lot of it has metal bars, but things like signs, these signs that alert us to the presence of greater sage grouse and sharp-tailed grouse, and the signs that are the boundary signs, all got burned. This shows the fencing that remains is marked with little white markers to make it more visible to the grouse. They're plastic, a lot of those melted. So even where there's some preservation of infrastructure, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, both in terms of just the needs of running the operations day to day at Swanson Lakes Wildlife Area, as well as the recovery work that goes on. And then turning to habitat, one of the things that I've enjoyed going out post-fire and have done this after other fires is looking at the fact that it's not totally destructive to even the animals, and there are things that can survive, things that can run, things that can fly, things that can burrow. And what I show here is the thatch ants. If you're familiar with them, they're an ant that builds these humongous mounds with vegetation, and this is a thatch ant hill. The mound, the covering is completely burned, but the ants, well, they seemed a little stunned, were pretty busy. I was wondering where they were going to find any vegetation to rebuild the mound, but they seem to be doing the things that ants do and looking quite busy. I've seen a lot of beetles out there, which is good because that's forage for a number of things. It's fun to look for tracks. Coyotes, of course, are abundant. And I showed you where the old office burned in the fall. The surrounding vegetation, it was kind of an interesting place where the office was built because it was really in a wetland. So it supported a lot of old nice aspens and poplars that I'm sure were planted. And it was always a good place to look for fall migrants and spring migrants. So I stopped by wondering if there would be any activity, and saw some pretty interesting birds. This was a golden-crowned sparrow that was among a bunch of white-crowned sparrows about a month ago. Then the ponds, the vernal ponds have pretty much all burned up, although there's good evidence that there's moisture in the soil there. But some of the year-round ponds are still quite active. And I'm always amazed at, I've birded so much at Swanson Lakes Wildlife Area. I'm always amazed when I find a new species, and I was out there a few weeks ago and looked out and saw gulls sitting on the lake. I don't ever recall seeing gulls, and then I did a double take. There were 10 Bonaparte's gulls sitting on Swanson Lakes. I've never seen, as I said, I've never seen gulls even, but a flock of Bonapartes was really quite a surprise. So that's about survival. As I mentioned, we lost all of the leks to the wildfire at Swanson Lakes, and here I show a couple. This is the sage-grouse lek, and this is the Swanson Lakes sharp-tail lek. I really don't think they're going to get a lot of use next spring because there's no place for cover for reproduction, which brings me to the concern for all of these species that they face immediately is kind of getting through the winter. I've seen a lot of mule deer. This actually shows some in the distance. And right now, when there's not snow on the ground, there's really quite a bit of forage because there is grass poking through, and that's kind of what they live on. But it's going to get difficult as the winter progresses, both in terms of forage and cover for any of the species to survive. And it's something that we're thinking about in terms of recovery going forward, is how to get things through the winter. Since I bring up mule deer, I'll just mention that it is hunting season, the biologists, after a wildfire, tend not to close the season, which seems a little contradictory, but we do use hunting as a conservation strategy, and so the idea is that human hunters will take some of the deer and kind of right-size the population to get through the winter. So, as I said, it seems a little contradictory, but it's a common practice after wildfires to proceed with hunting season. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the fabulous work that Mike has been doing and all the thought and effort that went into it, and also the contributions that Spokane Audubon is making to the work, because one of the things that's a challenge to getting in and doing restoration is having the seed to get the projects done. So at Swanson Lakes, and I'm focusing on Swanson Lakes, so the Whitney fire, we're really lucky to have a lot of preliminary information that our partners at BLM and Mike have been working on for years in terms of understanding what the habitat looks like. Mike Schroeder has done ecologic integrity monitoring, and the BLM staff has hired people to do a lot of on-the-ground comparison to aerial. And what this map shows, this is the Whitney Road fire perimeter, and it shows vegetation cover for the area. And this was used to help determine where it would make sense to go in immediately after the fire, or this fall, which is when the planning is done, and do some restorations. And the thinking was that areas with the densest shrub would be the most highly burned for a couple of reasons. Sagebrush is pretty flammable, and the understory in dense shrub tends to be fairly scant. And so it's likely that the vegetation would suffer severe loss in these densely shrubbed areas. And this is what's going on. This is about a little less than a month after the fire, where the teams are out sort of surveying, using the maps to identify the areas and confirming the degree of probable vegetation loss in the areas. And then with that information, it was used to develop where the planting would occur if they were able to pull it together for the fall. And just as an example of what they're looking at, this is burned bunch grass. And what you could do is, kind of kick it, and if it didn't sustain any root at all, it would completely disintegrate like this. I mean, you could tell it was completely dead. And that's what we would find. This was one of those dense sagebrush areas. That's what we would find as we'd go out, is it looked like the grass was pretty much dead. And that was an indication that there was unlikely to be any regrowth, at least early on. So with that information, this is the map that was developed to decide on where the restorations would be for the fall. I think this is the area where many of you went out and did some shrub and wildflower plantings last week. The preparation that needed to go into this was just amazing. There's a small window when the planting's going to be effective in terms of time. And the way that a large area could be covered would be with aerial seeding. But the aerial seeding can be pretty iffy, because you're just dumping a bunch of seed on the ground, basically. And so some preparation was required in advance, soil preparation in these areas. As well as the idea we had was try to get the seeding, the aerial seeding, coordinated with a good potential for precipitation to follow. And so it all, with a ton of work by Mike and his assistant Donovan, and a whole lot of people on the team, Julie and our vegetation expert. There were a lot of people involved, but Mike really in the lead, did manage to, just in time, within this window, get the seed, I think it was 400 acres in the ground, right before our big snow. So it couldn't have been more perfect, but it wasn't luck. It was all hard work. And then finally, there is a good opportunity for recovery since fire is part of this ecosystem. If you don't have that really intense burn that kills everything. And so about a month after we were out there doing the survey, I went back out to see what might be regrowing. And one of the really gratifying pieces is where restorations had taken place. And this is a restoration that was planted, I think, a year ago. Is that right, Mike? You can nod your head. This is the windmill. It was obvious that the planting had good survival when we were walking through that field during the initial survey. In contrast to those bunch grasses that I showed that completely disintegrated, these were quite intact. So it really looked like there was pretty good survival. This is immediately following the fire. And if you use your imagination, you can see that there's quite a bit of green in the field. This is another view of it. a month later following that snow and the melt. And then up close, you can see some of the bunch grass. I think this is wild geranium that survived and is growing a month later. The shrubs, in contrast to some arid community shrubs, sagebrush will completely lose its root system if it's an intense burn. And what is required for sagebrush survival of a fire is survival of stands of sagebrush or some of the bushes so that it can reseed. There are other arid ecosystems where root systems are protected from fire and they actually grow back from the roots. That's less likely with sagebrush. It tends to have to survive enough to reseed. Vegetation can be quite resilient. There's more of a question with, as I mentioned, wildlife survival into the future. And as an example, this map shows older burns. These are not the Whitney Road burn. There are older burns in the area. The purple is let's see, no, the lighter tan is the Swanson Lakes Wildlife Area, and then this darker area is BLM. These fire perimeters, what it shows, these dots here are documented nesting sites of sage grouse and sharp-tailed grouse from older studies. And what it shows is we could not document any nesting within the fire perimeters. And this was years after the fires. This fire, this is the 2011 Apache Pass fire, I think. The other one is an older fire. So there's enough change, it seems, from fire that it does deter at least reproductive behavior in these species. That's why restoration is so important to these ecosystems. And I think that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. So if there are any questions, this is another hopeful sign. As Mike said, we've been seeing some sharp tails, or there have been some reported sightings, and Mike himself has seen some. These are sage-grouse feathers that I picked up last month, and they aren't burned. So there must be some and it wasn't a pile from mortality either. They were individual feathers, so something seemed to survive out there.
So if anybody, if anybody has questions, you can type in your question in the chat box that's in the bottom center of your screen if you move your cursor, or we could take audio questions, but you need to unmute yourself if you want to speak.
Kim, you did an excellent job. I mean, you covered everything very thorough. It's a pleasure having you out there. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you for the Audubon organization for all they've done to help us out at Swanson Lakes. So, like I say, what Kim said about saving, I think that parking lot and the donation that was made for the gravel for that parking lot is what saved our new office. So I just want to thank everybody. It's your organization has been tremendous for what has happened. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Kim.
Go ahead, whoever was speaking.
Oh, My speaker doesn't work well. That's why I'm not doing it. I just said, thank you, Kim.
Speaking of which, there's also a way to, to the right of center, there's a reaction. You can put thumbs up and you can clap. But there is a question for how many acres were completely killed out of the 127,000 Whitney fire?
Well, we're completely killed. I don't think that has been worked out. The Swanton Lakes itself was 95% burned. But as I showed, what we've been able to correlate, there was a considerable amount of dense sagebrush within the interior south of the office area. A lot of that area was very, very dense. And if the correlation holds up, I would estimate that at least a third of the area may be really very burned. But we were walking through some of the areas with dense sagebrush and seeing some stands. It was curious. We went to one stand, and you look around, and it was completely very burned. A lot of evidence of grass that had died completely, and then this stand of grass and a sagebrush. And as best we could tell, there was a vernal pond close by. So we assumed that maybe there was more moisture in the soil that might have protected it. And as long as these stands are around, as I mentioned, they will contribute to recovery. But knowing exactly the amount, it's hard to say. And I don't see who added, David, thank you. David Kraft reminded me that Eriogonum is buckwheat. I should have been on the tip of my tongue. Thanks, David. Of course you would remind me of that.
And I have a question, Kim. You mentioned out there that one of the components might be three-tip sage, and that does have some ability to resprout after fire. And I don't know if anybody's thought about trying to recover with, I don't know what the usage of three-tip is by sharptail and sage grouse, but maybe a more fire resilient shrub replanting with maybe three-tip might be a future consideration. I'm just guessing here, but it does have the ability, if it's not totally wiped out in an intense fire, to resprout a little bit. So it's just a thought. I don't know if anybody's considered that, because again, they may be so obligate to big sagebrush that the three-tip stands aren't as important. I don't know. Well,
big sagebrush is really important to sage grouse. So, it is their winter forage. And I don't know, I've seen a lot of crops, unfortunately, in my day. And it's always big sagebrush that I see in the crop, whether that's because it's there or whether they require it. I don't really know. There's been some work on that. It'd be interesting to follow up, but that's useful information. There is not a lot of three-tip. We come to patches of it, but it's pretty sparse out there.
I got to tell you, as far as wintering, there's not a lot of wintering areas for sharptails, but what is out there and some of the stands of aspen that are there, actually fire and aspen do well together. So yeah. We've seen a lot of regrowth and thicker stands from aspen after a fire. So that's a positive thing there.
Yeah, that's a really good point because fire is certainly important for aspen.
Kim, Madonna here. I understand from Kurt Berg, the department's vegetation ecologist, that the forbs are particularly important for birds, not just for direct forage, but because they attract insects. And they
Yes.
need those insects, especially in
Yes.
the spring and with the young and all that. And so I just wanted, I guess, in a way to remind everyone that this chapter has put most of our effort, our donations, towards forb restoration. And that's why some of us were out last week starting to plant them and everything. So I encourage everyone listening and tell all your friends that, you know, we've got an ongoing donation fund for that to work on that, because forbs are a lot more expensive because they're, you know, Kurt has told us the survival rate on them is better if you can put plants in the ground rather than seeds. So that's why we were out there and why we're asking for donations.
Lindell, or excuse me, Kim, I have a further question. Next spring, is anybody anticipating doing some more nesting surveys in the burned areas to, I guess, based on that previous data, all those nesting sites being on the perimeter of the old burned areas, might be interesting to see. Since it's so completely burned, there's probably not much perimeter in the traditional areas. I don't know if there's going to be opportunities. Maybe that's where volunteers can help do some transects to look for nests.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, I'll have to work with the wildlife biologist on that. We were able to do nesting surveys because we had radio marked birds previously. So we did not use a transect methodology, although in a bare area it might work. So it's not easy finding a sage-grouse nest, even with a hen sitting on it. So.
Well, I think our time is sort of wrapped up and I haven't seen any additional questions. So let's give Kim a hand. You can click your clap button in the bottom right, and we certainly appreciate all she's done, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
And thanks,
Thank you.
Ken Audubon.
Thanks, Kim.
Bye.
Thank you, Kim.
See you next
See you
month.
soon, Mike.
You bet.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.